The Eerie house on the lake. The mist hung low over the water, a gray, suffocating blanket that seemed to swallow the sound of the outboard motor. Rachel sat at the bow, her knuckles white as she gripped the gunwale of the small, rusted rental boat. Behind her, Sarah steered, her hair whipping violently in the damp lake breeze, her eyes darting toward the looming silhouette of the island that sat like a jagged, black tooth in the center of the dark water. "You realize," Sarah shouted over the mechanical chugging of the motor, "that every horror movie in the history of cinema starts exactly like this. We're one bad decision away from a jump scare and a body count." Rachel turned, a grin tugging at her lips, though it lacked its usual genuine warmth. It was a mask of bravery, brittle and thin. "And you realize that's exactly what people say right before they find out the legends are just stories for tourists. Thinman and Jeff the Killer? Sarah, please. It's an abandoned property, not a portal to the abyss." Sarah scoffed, easing the throttle back as the island grew larger, its shoreline a mess of dead reeds and rotting driftwood. "Right. Because historical records regarding the Eerie house on the lake, which, by the way, sounds like a bargain bin paperback, are totally reliable. The rental guy wouldn't even look me in the eye when he handed over the keys. He looked like he was witnessing an execution." "He was hung over," Rachel countered, though she couldn't help but look back at the dense, unnatural wall of trees that lined the island's perimeter. The trees here were different from those on the mainland. They were twisted, skeletal fingers clawing at the overcast sky, stripped of leaves despite the season. A profound silence seemed to radiate from the land, a heavy, airless quiet that made the gentle lap of the lake water sound unnervingly like a warning. The boat bumped against a rotted wooden dock that groaned in protest, splintering under the impact. Rachel stood up, testing the stability of the wood with a hesitant boot. It felt soft, spongy with decay, yet it held. "Adventure," Rachel said, though the word sounded hollow against the oppressive stillness. "Remember, this is how we become the ones who made it to the island, instead of the ones who stayed in the dorm and studied for midterms." "I think I'd take the midterms," Sarah muttered, tying the boat off to a rusted iron cleat that looked like it hadn't seen a rope in 50 years. She jumped onto the dock, her movements sharp and twitchy. She looked at the forest path, which was choked with thorny overgrowth and choked with a fog that seemed to cling to the ground like a living thing. "Is it just me, or is the air temperature dropping 20 degrees every step we take toward that house?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She was staring up at the house, visible now through a break in the trees. It was a Victorian relic, looming against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. The windows were empty, jagged holes that looked like sightless eyes, and the roofline was tilted at a nauseating, structural impossibility. Even from here, she could feel the weight of it, a crushing, physical presence that pressed against her chest, making her heart hammer a frantic, arrhythmic beat. "It's just an old building, Sarah," Rachel said, reaching out to touch the rough bark of a nearby tree. The bark felt cold, vibrating with a low, subaudible hum that made her teeth ache. She pulled her hand away, startled, but shrugged it off as an electrical charge from the humidity. Old houses have settled foundations. Creaky floorboards. That doesn't mean it's haunted. It just means it needs a contractor. "I don't think a contractor is going to help that," Sarah said, gesturing toward the house. The structure sat in a small clearing that felt unnaturally devoid of birdsong or insect noise. The grass around the base of the foundation was gray, brittle, as if something had leached every drop of vitality from the soil years ago. There were no paths, only the crushed remains of foliage that looked as though it had been trampled, not by time, but by something large and deliberate. "We have the flashlight," Rachel said, her voice firmer now, forced. She reached into her backpack and clicked it on. The beam of light was a stark, aggressive white, cutting a hole through the pervasive gray. "We walk in, we take the photos for the blog, we prove there's nothing here, and we leave. 20 minutes, max." Sarah looked at the dark maw of the front porch, then back at the water. The boat bobbed rhythmically, an umbilical cord to the world of the living. 20 minutes. "If I see a single shadow that moves on its own, I am turning around and dragging you back to that boat by your hair." "Deal," Rachel agreed. They stepped off the dock. As their feet hit the matted, dead grass of the island, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive weight didn't lift, it settled. The air grew thick, tasting of ozone and wet earth. Rachel felt a strange, tingling sensation at the base of her skull, a prickling, electric awareness that she couldn't identify. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was a sudden, heightened sense of proximity, as if the house itself were watching their approach, waiting to see which one of them would break first. They began to walk, their footsteps muffled by the carpet of decaying leaves. Every twig that snapped sounded like a gunshot in the unnatural silence. Rachel kept her eyes forward, her gaze locked on the front door, a massive slab of rotting oak that hung slightly off its hinges. She didn't want to look at the windows. She didn't want to see what might be standing behind the glass, watching their path. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping abruptly. Rachel froze. She held her breath, the pulse in her neck thumping loudly in her ears. She listened past the sound of the wind, past the distant lap of the lake. There was a sound. A rhythmic, dragging noise, like fabric being pulled over stone, coming from somewhere deep inside the thicket to their left. It was slow, deliberate, and undeniably heavy. "Probably just a deer," Rachel said, though the words felt like a lie even as they left her lips. "A deer doesn't walk like that," Sarah hissed, her hand gripping Rachel's sleeve. That sounded like weight. Like someone dragging something heavy. Rachel turned the flashlight beam toward the trees. The light danced over the skeletal trunks, illuminating nothing but rotting wood and swirling mist. The sound had stopped. Everything was still again, but the feeling of being observed had sharpened. It wasn't just the house anymore. The island itself felt predatory, a sprawling, tangled trap closing its jaws. "We're on edge because of the stories," Rachel whispered, forcing herself to take another step toward the house. "That's what this is. We're psyching ourselves out. We're college students, Sarah. We're rational beings. We don't believe in bogeymen." "We don't," Sarah agreed, her voice trembling just enough to betray her. She kept her eyes fixed on the house, her free hand clutching the strap of her bag as if it were a shield. "But looking at that front door? I'm starting to think maybe the bogeymen aren't interested in our belief system." They reached the steps of the porch. The wood was slick with a dark, oily film. As they ascended, the temperature plummeted, and the smell of the place hit them, not just rot, but a sweet, cloying decay that clung to the back of the throat, the scent of stagnant water and old blood. Rachel reached for the heavy iron handle of the front door. Her hand hovered there, trembling. She wasn't an explorer anymore. She was a guest being invited into a tomb. She looked back at Sarah, whose face was pale, her eyes wide and reflecting the harsh, artificial light of the torch. "Ready?" Rachel asked, her voice a fragile thing. Sarah didn't answer. She just nodded, her jaw set, her loyalty overriding the screaming instinct in her gut that told her to run back to the boat, to start the engine, and to never look back at the gray, silent island again. Rachel pushed. The door groaned, a long, high-pitched shriek of tortured metal, and swung inward into the darkness of the hall. The rusted hinges groaned, a metallic shriek that sounded less like mechanical wear and more like a warning cut short. Rachel stepped over the threshold, her flashlight beam slicing through the thick, stagnant air. Dust motes danced in the light like swarming insects, suspended in a space that felt as if it hadn't breathed in a century. Sarah followed, her hand white-knuckled as she gripped the fabric of Rachel's jacket. "Okay," Sarah whispered, her voice tight, lacking the playful edge she'd worn on the boat. "We see it, we snap some photos, we leave. This place it's wrong, Ratch." "It's just an old house, Sar," Rachel replied, though she didn't quite believe it. She swept her light across the foyer. The wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips, revealing damp rotted lath beneath that looked like the exposed ribs of a carcass. A massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror dominated the far wall, its silver backing so oxidized it looked like a bruise under the glass. As they moved deeper into the foyer, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't a gradual cooling, it was a wall of frost that hit their skin, forcing their breath to bloom in thick, gray plumes. Did you feel that? Sarah stopped dead, her eyes darting toward the grand staircase that curved upward into a hollow, jagged darkness. Draft, Rachel said, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a step toward the center of the room, her boots clicking sharply against the warped floorboards. Old foundations settle. Air channels through the gaps. That wasn't a draft, Sarah countered, her voice trembling. That felt like someone just walked through us. Rachel ignored her, trying to reclaim the bravado that had brought them here. She raised her camera, the lens cap already removed. She clicked a picture of the staircase. The flash ignited the room, turning the shadows into jagged, ink-black shapes for a split second. In the blinding strobe, for a fraction of a heartbeat, Rachel saw something at the top of the stairs. A silhouette. Tall. Stationary. It wasn't the shape of a coat rack or a decorative pillar. It was humanoid, rigid, and watching them with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand upright. Did you see that? Rachel whispered, her hand lowering the camera. See what? Sarah gripped her arm, digging her nails in. I'm not looking at anything. I'm staring at the floor. Rachel, let's go. This isn't a haunted house attraction. This is a tomb. I saw someone. At the top of the stairs. Don't do that, Sarah pleaded, pulling at Rachel's sleeve. I'm not playing the what was that noise game. We are leaving. Rachel took a tentative step toward the staircase, compelled by a morbid curiosity she couldn't suppress. As she moved, the smell hit her, a sudden, cloying stench of copper and wet earth. It was the scent of a butcher shop left to bake in the sun. Do you smell that? Rachel asked, gagging. Sarah didn't answer. She was looking at the floorboards at the base of the stairs. Following her gaze, Rachel tilted her light downward. There were drag marks. Not in the dust, but in the wood itself, as if something heavy and clawed had been hauled across the floorboards, scoring deep, jagged furrows into the grain. The grooves led away from the stairs and toward the dark expanse of the library. That didn't happen from age, Sarah whispered, her bravado completely shattered now. She looked at Rachel, her eyes wide, glistening with genuine terror. We aren't alone here. We need to leave. Now. Rachel hesitated. She felt a strange, humming pressure at the base of her skull, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to synchronize with the beating of her own heart. It was as if the house was responding to her presence, waking up from a long, hungry slumber. She reached out to touch the wall, her fingertips brushing the damp, peeling wallpaper. The moment her skin made contact, a whisper slithered into her mind, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone, unintelligible yet undeniably malicious. She recoiled, stumbling back into Sarah. What? Sarah asked, her voice bordering on a sob. I thought I heard a voice, Rachel stammered, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the flashlight. It clattered across the floor, spinning and casting chaotic, strobe-like beams across the room. In the erratic light, the foyer transformed. The shadows of the furniture seemed to stretch and contort, reaching for them like spindly, skeletal fingers. Then, the house went silent. Not the natural quiet of an empty building, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator holding its breath. From the darkness of the library, the sound came again, the heavy, dragging thud they had heard on the path, amplified 100-fold by the hollow acoustics of the house. Thump. Drag. Thump. Drag. It was coming toward them. Run, Sarah breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. The front door, Rachel said, grabbing Sarah's hand, but as they spun around, the heavy oak door they had entered through slammed shut with a finality that shook the frames of the house. Rachel lunged for the handle, yanking at it, but it didn't budge. It was as if the metal had fused to the frame. The brass knob turned in her hand, loose and spinning, stripped of its mechanism. "It's locked," Rachel cried, beating her fists against the wood. "It's locked from the outside." Thump. Drag. Thump. The sound was closer now. It was at the edge of the library doorway. Rachel spun back around, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered remnants of what might have once been formal attire. His skin was the color of curdled milk, and his eyes, when the dying beam of the flashlight finally caught them, weren't eyes at all. They were pits of rotted, crimson light. He didn't run. He didn't charge. He simply stood there, watching them with a hungry, predatory patience, a slight, jagged smile spreading across his face as he tilted his head to the side. "Welcome," the creature rasped, his voice a chorus of grinding teeth. "We have been waiting for someone with such vibrant pulse." Sarah let out a shriek, grabbing a heavy, rusted fire poker from a nearby stand. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking. The man laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. He took a step forward, his movement unervingly fluid, defying the stiff, deathly pallor of his frame. "The girl with the steel, I like. But the one with the light." He turned his red gaze directly onto Rachel. "She is the one we were promised." Rachel felt the air solidify around her. She tried to move, to turn and find another way out, but her limbs felt heavy, weighted by an invisible force. The humming at the base of her skull intensified, turning into a high-pitched whine that drowned out Sarah's frantic shouts. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vast, suffocating room. The creature stopped a few feet away. The smell of copper was overwhelming now, choking her. "I am the herald of the change, little one. And you are the canvas." Before Rachel could react, the figure blurred. It wasn't a physical movement, it was a shift in perspective, a blink of the eye that saw the distance between them evaporate. He was right in front of her, his hand, cold as an ice pick, snapping out to clamp onto her shoulder. The contact sent a searing jolt of agony through her, not of the skin, but of the soul. Rachel screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the hollow house, as the shadows in the foyer began to rise like ink in water, sealing them inside a room that no longer felt like a part of the world they knew. The foyer floorboards groaned, not under the weight of their feet, but as if the house itself were drawing a ragged, rattling breath. Rachel's knees hit the floor, a hollow, splintering sound, but she didn't feel the impact. She felt only the cold, iron-like grip of the man with the red eyes, and a sudden, violent rushing in her ears, like blood being forced through a narrow pipe. Sarah lunged, the heavy iron fire poker whistling through the stale air. She swung it with everything she had, a desperate, shrieking arc intended for the stranger's head. But the vampire didn't even turn. With his free hand, he caught the poker mid-swing. The metal groaned, bending like soft wax under his grip. He backhanded Sarah without looking, his movement a blur of predatory grace. She slammed into the wall, sliding down to the floor in a heap of gasps and shattered dignity. "Sarah!" Rachel's scream died in her throat, choked off by the vampire's tightening hold. The stranger leaned in. He smelled of ozone, stagnant lake water, and something else, something ancient and copper-rich. "Humanity is such a brittle shell, isn't it, Rachel?" he whispered. His voice was melodic but jagged, like broken glass on silk. "You came looking for ghosts. You thought this was a game of dress-up and urban legends. You have no idea what it means to truly stop breathing." He pulled her closer, his thumb pressing into the sensitive hollow of her throat. Rachel's vision flickered. Shadows crawled across the walls of the foyer, not like reflections, but like living ink, stretching and pulsing in time with the thrumming in her veins. She tried to kick out, but her limbs felt heavy, weighted by an invisible, suffocating pressure. "No," Sarah wheezed, pushing herself up from the floor. She scrambled for her discarded flashlight, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. She swung the beam toward them, the light cutting through the gloom. "Let her go." The vampire turned his head, the red irises of his eyes glowing with an internal, hellish fire. He bared his teeth, not the straight, white pearls of a human, but serrated, elongated ivory that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "The witness," the vampire mused, his eyes fixated on Sarah. "Pity. You are quite spirited. But the ritual requires a certain symmetry." He didn't wait. He drove his face toward Rachel's neck. Rachel felt the sharp, electric prick of his fangs piercing the skin. It wasn't the dull pain of a needle. It was a white-hot supernova that raced through her nervous system, shattering her consciousness. She convulsed, her back arching, her hands clawing blindly at his leather coat. The world tilted. The foyer, the peeling wallpaper, the rotting dust, the dim light, began to bleed into a kaleidoscope of terrifying, dark colors. She heard Sarah scream her name, a thin, distant sound like a kite string snapping in a gale. Then, the silence of the house intensified, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Within the bite, there was a transfer. Rachel felt her own life, the memories of college exams, the smell of coffee on a rainy morning, the warmth of the sun, being siphoned away, replaced by a cold, numbing void. Her blood didn't feel like it was being stolen, it felt like it was being rewritten. "Don't fight," a voice echoed, not in her ears, but inside the marrow of her bones. It was a cold, commanding resonance that felt like David's shadow. "Accept the change. The canvas must be prepared." Rachel tried to blink, but her eyelids were leaden. She saw Sarah being seized by a second figure, a man who had stepped silently from the library's gloom, but the image was distorted, seen through a veil of crimson static. Sarah was screaming, struggling as the second vampire, whose face was a mask of cold, aristocratic indifference, clamped a hand over her mouth. "The girl is mine," the second vampire, Jack, murmured to his companion. "Mark, you're always so messy with your masterpieces." "Beauty requires sacrifice," Mark hissed, finally pulling back from Rachel's neck. Rachel collapsed. She hit the floorboards, her body twitching. The pain was receding, replaced by a terrifying, icy clarity. She could hear the house, not just the wind outside, but the movement of beetles in the walls, the vibration of the foundation shifting against the bedrock, the frantic, terrified heartbeat of her friend Sarah. She turned her head, her movements sluggish, like someone swimming through cooling tar. Sarah was being dragged toward the dark hallway leading to the library. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that glance, the fear was still there, but beneath it, a dark, pulsing hunger had begun to bloom in Rachel's gut, a hunger that made her skin crawl. "Sarah." Rachel's voice came out as a raspy, unnatural growl that she didn't recognize. Mark stepped over her, his boots crunching on the dust. He looked down at her with a mix of triumph and professional detachment. He didn't see a victim anymore, he saw an investment. He signaled to Jack, who began to drag a clawing, kicking Sarah deeper into the darkness. "Wait for the sun to set, my dear," Mark whispered, stepping back into the shadows. "The real show begins in the dark." The foyer was plunged into absolute blackness as the last of the ambient light was swallowed by the shadows themselves. Rachel lay in the dark, her heartbeat slowing, deepening into a rhythm that matched the hollow, rhythmic thumping of the house. She wasn't just Rachel Calhoun anymore. The girl who had come to the island to debunk myths was dead, buried under the weight of an ancient, cold necessity. She felt the strength returning to her limbs, but it was alien. It was sharp, cold, and electric. She gripped the edge of a rotting floorboard, her fingers digging through the wood as if it were soft clay. She looked toward the hallway where they had taken Sarah, her vision adjusting to the dark until the room was no longer black, but painted in shades of monochrome depth and heat signatures. She could see them, the heat signatures of her friends, and the cold, static silhouettes of their tormentors. She pushed herself up. The floorboard snapped under her grip like a dry twig. She was ready. And she was starving.